Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're going to look at a very interesting controversy that's emerged. It's not so much a controversy as a discussion of a different set of facts. That is, the facts haven't sort of encountered one another. They're parallel sets of facts. So it's not an argument, it's just a different kind of narrative that's going on in our country and indeed around the world. It has to do with what might be called the legacies of colonialism. Now, we all have experienced colonialism, in fact even celebrated it in some countries. In the United States, there's a very interesting embracing of the colonial past as a component of what makes us great, according to some people. But others have a different narrative about the same set of facts, as well as bringing in to focus a whole different range of facts, which they suggest others who are talking about embracing the colonial past are forgetting. So we're going to look at a little bit of this dialogue past one another. It might be called a mutual monologue instead of a dialogue, but it's going on now very dramatically because we're in the year of 2019. Now, you may not think the year 2019 is very significant, but in fact, we're going to look at this question because it's true, we haven't focused on it. If you think back hundreds of years, and maybe even 400 years, the year 1619, if you ask most Americans who are steeped in colonial history what the year 1619 means, they'll say, well, that's the year before 1620. And 1620 was when the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth and the American settlement communities started in earnest. But if we're trying to overcome, in a sense, some of the legacies, the multiple legacies of the European colonialism, we're going to have to ask that sober question: can the West survive its most cherished historical myths, beginning with 1619 and 1620? Myths about the democratic foundations of North American settlements abound, with a great narrative about the historic arrival in Plymouth in 1620, toward the end of that year, in November basically, when there was snow on the ground, when it was difficult, very difficult, and some heroes actually emerged from that proceeding with a great deal of accolades and subsequent veneration by generations. The Indians are off on the side, even in artistic representations of this, and are marginalized in many representations altogether. And those who look to the 1620 date as a founding date for the American colonies tend to emphasize that the Mayflower Compact, which was drawn up on the ship, the Mayflower, that arrived in 1620 in and around Provincetown. The Mayflower Compact was signed by the colonists before they really settled on shore. And they're indicating in the Mayflower Compact an agreement to certain kind of conditions for settlement in this particular North American colony. It's often cited as the source of some of the early democratic institutions. And of course it was written in stone and actually persists to this day as a monument down in Plymouth, Massachusetts, with the year 1620 engraved upon it. But an alternative narrative is starting to emerge as people look at the documents and other parts of the United States which were previously colonies, especially African Americans who are embracing the 1619 to 2019, 400 years, and looking at, in effect, the fact that in 1619 a ship with 20 slaves showed up in Jamestown, Virginia, and the slaves were sold and taken on the land settlement to assist, as it were, the plantation economies that were getting going in the Virginia area. This 400 years is being celebrated down in New Haven by several prominent Yale professors and others. In fact, the winner of the Nobel, not Nobel, but the Historical Prize, the Bancroft Prize, and the Distinguished American Historical Association Prize this year is a fellow named David Blight, and he's chairing this session. It's going to take place later in September, in fact, this coming week. Meanwhile, here in Boston, at the Museum of African American History, there was a program kicked off yesterday entitled Legacies of 1619. It was a very good program of historians convened to discuss what the different legacies of 1619, including a very famous legacy of 1919, 100 years ago, were, and what do we know about them. The Massachusetts Historical Society has teamed up with the Roxbury Community College and the Museum of African and African American History to discuss this. And in fact, they're doing 3 more programs this next few months, in October and in November and December itself. In fact, nationwide there's an effort to talk about a nation born in contradiction, a democracy defined by black struggle ever since 1619, a year before the 1620 date. And professional historians and academics like Professor Henry Louis Gates have pointed this out again and again. There's a lot of loose talk these days about making America great again without very much awareness about what made America great in the first place. When it's founded on the principle of eradicating the indigenous population, ecocide and genocide involved in wiping out the Native American Indians, and then built upon the slave labor of imported migrants, non-voluntary migrants, in fact the largest non-voluntary migration in human history, the slave trade, it's hard to think about our current vocabulary of making America great again without thinking about, okay, what made it great in the first place? Wasn't immigration a key component of it? Not an add-on, not an ancillary thing that was just thought about recently. Immigration is at the core of what made America great. And it made the whole continent of the Western colonies, from the West Indies through what we can now call Latin America, great in some respect. The Columbian Exchange was, in effect, what took place after 1492, but we've got to look at what was the feature of this Columbian Exchange. What happened was a lot of people came in one direction and a lot of other things went in another direction. The people coming in this direction came with a lot of diseases, 4-footed animals, and a whole series of habits that added up to a kind of ecological imperialism that expressed itself as the expansion of Europe through about 1900 on New World territory, thought to be empty, but it wasn't empty at all. And in effect, the conquest that was accomplished not so much by, or solely by military activity, but by diseases and the invasion of new animals like goats, sheep, horses, and pigs, which totally changed the food supply in the New World, and in fact created the conditions that eventually gave rise to plantation slavery, because there was a labor shortage. Having a collapse of the local population from diseases, Europeans that showed up with plenty of capital and access to land were faced with a labor-scarce economy. And in the labor scarcity, they resorted to importing labor from Africa. Industrialization followed from that chapter very naturally. First of all, industrialization was only possible because of the profits made in the slave trade and slave labor economies of the plantations. But in addition, the enduring fact in a labor-scarce economy was that labor was the most expensive input to production. In relative terms, land and capital, partially from the profits of the slave trade itself, were plentiful, but labor was scarce, therefore relatively expensive. It was in relation to the other two components of production, land and capital, labor was relatively expensive. Now that's a very interesting circumstance historically, because when labor is scarce, it gets imported from one part of the world to the next. But also another thing starts to happen, namely people start to economize on the expensive input into the production process. They try to find other ways to meet the needs of a labor-scarce economy. And the mechanization of work is one of those means. And eventually, the industrialization of the mechanisms. That is, the application of external power sources to the mechanized production train starts to get going. Prior to the 1780s, most of the American economy rested on the energy of slaves, an energy which was relatively expensive, the most expensive of the three inputs to production: land, capital, and labor, which had to be imported from thousands of miles away. It was the expensive input in these threefold inputs to production: land, capital, and labor. And people have started to calculate, in fact, how expensive it was. It was most expensive in relation to those two things, and for that reason, anything that could save upon the number of human beings that needed to be put into work in that system was introduced. And eventually, oil becomes substituted for the energy of slaves. You can actually calculate how many slaves a gallon of oil displaces. There were two other phases. There was a steam phase that was driven by coal, then petroleum, oil, and now, as it turns out, natural gas. Those last three are fossil fuel substitutions for the energy of slaves. Slave plantation agricultural production combined with industrial processing in both sugar and especially with King Cotton. And this is what made America great as an international economic power. It's been written up in several historical accounts, especially the Empire of Cotton, a global history, by Sven Beckert. The history of cotton provides a primary example of how, with the introduction of mechanical manufacturing technology, agriculture itself began to become a part of an industrial production system. We normally think of the division between agriculture and industry, right? Agriculture somehow happens independent of industry, which is sort of urban-based. But in fact, when you link the two together, especially with a slave production in the agricultural sector, you have an extraordinary power for a new kind of empire, an empire of cotton, based initially on water power, supplemented then by coal power, then by petroleum power, and ultimately by natural gas. This is the global history of industrialization. Increasingly, with the development of industrial processes based on water power and later fossil fuels, agricultural production became a subordinate part of industrial production. Now this is problematic because agriculture is part of a natural ecosystemic process. It's based on biology, not on machines. And yet machines and industrial production become the organizing principle for agriculture. This is problematic, and one of the most problematic implications of this is the legacy it leaves from all colonialisms. We can find out about it here in the Boston area very easily, because the earliest forms of manufacturing are right here in Waltham, Massachusetts. The Boston Manufacturing Company got going in 1813, and it was founded by Elijah Smith, based on water flow from the Charles River, basically. And that water flow was ultimately the power behind the looms that made it possible to take cotton in raw form and, in fact, make it into finished cloth. One process, all under the roof, one roof, with the help of water-driven power loom. Well, in the age of revolutions, you could see that this could industrialize parts of the world and create labor flows for another part of the world, and, in effect, the movement of cotton into the industrial process. Now, the early part of European colonial empires were straightforward smash and grab kinds of, not trade, but conquest, territorial conquest and grabbing. But that didn't last as long as the succeeding phase, moving from raiding colonialism to trading colonialism based on expanding markets. It was, in fact, the organizational innovation that solidified the habit of European economic growth. And that was not the raid so much as the trade through the company, the joint stock company in particular. Merchants bought shares in a company and expected an annual profit, an annual rate of return on what they had purchased as a share in the first place. Well, a joint stock company has enormous power in the sense that it can take the capital that's amassed from people who buy stock and start to invest it where? Well, anywhere that seems profitable. In particular, the slave trade, to begin with. When the joint stock company, the Dutch East India Company, the first joint stock company in the world, started to invest in the slave trade itself became a matter of corporate profit. And the company, as it's been written up in a book very interestingly, it's called A Short History of a Revolutionary Idea. The company became the driving force of an expanded trade in slaves. Well, this is pretty interesting, because it wasn't just the casual sale of 20 slaves as it was in 1619. It was the systematic process of acquiring slaves, transporting them, and delivering them to the New World economies that led to this revolutionary idea of the corporate agricultural production from slave-based plantations. You ought to look at it. Short history of a revolutionary idea. What happens then is that the company moves towards the notion of providing the capital for the early industrial processes that we can see here in Waltham, Massachusetts, or anywhere else where water power begins to be used to run looms, which process the agricultural products of the slave system. And it led, in the minds of many people thinking about colonialism, to the notion that there were stages of economic growth. This was a book written by a fellow named Walt Whitman Rostow, where he talked about the agricultural phase as a precursor to the emergence of industry, and the amassing of capital then made it possible to invest in new economizing forms of production. By economizing, he meant, well, you could do more with less. That's an economic decision. You could produce more with fewer laborers once you invest in mechanized production. that then becomes the self-perpetuating and expanding feature of industrialization throughout the world, driven, as I say, by new forms of energy. Water power at first, then coal, then petroleum, and then natural gas. Leading everywhere to the notion that growth was a function of an expanding market, and all you had to do was expand markets, and that became the thing you invested in, expanding markets. So the financing of growth became the focal point, even beyond the agricultural process or even the manufacturing process. The idea of expanding investments became the focal point of the economy as it is today. And the market emerged as a kind of god in the thinking process of those who inherited the legacy of this kind of colonial tradition. The trouble is that there are upper limits to growth in a finite ecosystem. Can't continuously expand in a finite ecosystem. And this was clearly demonstrated to the world back in 1972 in a very powerful book called The Limits to Growth, which was put out by the Club of Rome, right before the first meeting of environment secretaries to take place on a global basis in Stockholm, Sweden in 1972. People like William Catton put out books, very important ones, on overshoot, emphasizing that it's possible to go beyond the limits of a system, but only because you're overshooting its capacity for sustainability, and it will collapse. As he called it, the ecological basis of revolutionary change. The revolutionary change comes when the collapse occurs. This kind of growth he pointed to again and again, and it's very well illustrated in the population growth that occurred because of the substitution of petro-intensive agriculture, that is, agriculture subsidized by petroleum, tractors, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, the mechanization, and then the motorization of agricultural processes. Again, people are displaced, but machines, as it were, are said to take over and in fact make things more productive. They make more production possible, but if you measure the productivity in terms of inputs per output, they aren't in fact more productive. They're less productive. The reason is that it's a ratio. If you're putting more and more kilocalories into the system, yes, your production can increase, but you're getting less and less kilocalories out of the system. And the kind of growth in population which tripled since 1946 to 2010 has not been ever possible before in human history, and it won't be possible again. David Attenborough has warned about this again and again. Take a look.
Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
That's it, either mad or an economist. And in fact, that's the fact that we're up against. Every year now we face Overshoot Day, the day in which we pass in the annual calendar year the capacity of the Earth to support what we're doing. We're extracting beyond the capacity for the Earth to regenerate itself. This has been pointed out again and again in a series of essays on feeding the heart on fantasies and rubbish and racism becoming the source. We expanded upon the things of nature, and we thought that nature meant that expansion was in the nature of things. In fact, that's not true. It can't happen. Infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. and we're just beginning to learn this now. Thank you very much. See you next week.